All right, welcome back to Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality more than just skin deep. I'm so excited about our episode today. I have a colleague, Cicely Hunter. Um, I'm so excited about introducing you to her, y'all. So Cicely originally was supposed to come on to talk about Juneteenth, and we wasn't able to get around to getting that happening. So today I'm going to have Cicely introduce herself, and we'll go from there. Welcome, Cicely.
Thanks, Enzi. You're the greatest. I'm really looking forward to this episode, to dialogue with you. It's always a pleasure sharing space with you and just, vibing. It's a vibe, right?
Right, right.
So yes, just thanks again for having me. So just so that you all aware, just a little background about myself. I use she her pronouns. I am right now currently in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I work specifically as a DEI consultant, so I do speaking engagements and just really honing in on serving the community in the best way possible around equity, specifically around anti-Blackness. That is my expertise. I am a researcher, so I am in a doctoral program right now, which is actually in American Studies, and that's at St. Louis University. So I'm still in the dissertation phase right now, but working through that process as well. So my passion is history. I love to tell and share stories and narratives around the historical memory and just bringing us all up to date on what has happened so that we can continue to move forward in the initiatives around, you know, fighting racism and white supremacy. Ultimately, that's the goal.
That is the goal, and that is a difficult and complex goal. I can't wait to be able to call you Dr. Hunter. That's going to be exciting. And I'm really excited about this conversation. Folks who know me know that I'm very passionate about talking about anti Black racism and anti Blackness and how to dismantle that as well as dismantling white supremacy in all of its forms. So I'm excited about this conversation. Can you? I'm not sure if many people are familiar with what is meant by uh, historical memory. Can you kind of explain a little bit what that means?
Yeah, so essentially, I think of it as the way in which we tell stories around a particular topic. So I can give you an example. So I study 1910s and 1920s Black parades in Harlem, in New York, I should say Harlem and New York. Just in case some of them, of course, did not happen all specifically in Harlem. But the ways in which we remember those stories, sometimes there's points and periods of times where there's dips in the narrative, so you don't actually get the full, complete story of what transpired, and so the ways in which we remember it is not always accurate, and so
Hmm.
it's important for us to go back and to look at those records and see what exactly was transpiring at that time that led to such parades, that led to such
Hmm.
activism in the streets, owning of Black identity. What were they thinking about when they talked about identity pieces and being Black and being American, or being, for some folks, from being from the Caribbean, from being from
Hmm. Hmm.
Africa, and so forth, right? So it's that calling back of history and reminding ourselves of every intricate piece of it that knits that story together so that we have a more comprehensive narrative around the history, and that we're not just kind of paying lip service, but really doing the deep diving into it so that we can recall the things as if they really were at that time.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. So one of the things that I'm aware of is over the last few years is the reminder that our society does not have the same history and knowledge that all of us have. So I went to an all black school from preschool to eighth grade, and I had the privilege to get a very robust, particularly Black history. And so when I hear you talking about New York, but particularly Harlem, right in the 1910s and 20s, I assume you're talking a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. I also assume that some of our listeners may not have any idea what the Harlem Renaissance is, or some of the people who you might be referring to. And so this might be a really tough question to answer, and I will just share the Harlem Renaissance is one of my favorite subjects we learned in seventh grade, and we did this whole entire. I think this was a joy of not getting Black History only during February, and so we had a whole entire thing on the Harlem Renaissance. And so I'm curious how you could answer this question: what is the Harlem Renaissance, and maybe who is your favorite poet from the Harlem Renaissance?
Ooh, Enzi, drop the mic. Yes. Ooh, that's a really good question. Okay. Dang, Enzi, that's hard. So,
I couldn't do
okay.
it, y'all. I want to be honest with that. So
Yes. Okay, so let me get all my bearings together. So, essentially I would define the Harlem Renaissance as, and specifically, okay, so we know that Harlem Renaissance stretched even beyond just Harlem. So there were folks even in um
Kansas City,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And
that's my
so
hometown, y'all.
yes. So we have to be aware that it wasn't just about being in specifically in New York, because it stretched even outside of that. Because you have folks who are moving along the river. You have folks who are going overseas to England who are still talking about the Harlem and expanding their network. They were specifically talking about politics. They were talking about black arts and how to integrate what it meant to have an identity around blackness and being in America in some senses, or sometimes just being more broadly connecting it to the black diaspora. So that was essentially what the Harlem Renaissance was all about. It was about connecting that connective tissues and those pieces together. You have folks like Arthur Schomburg, who was essentially trying to make sure that we had a collection of pieces from beforehand to build out what's considered now the Schomburg Research Center. So you have folks like him, you have folks like Claude McKay, who has written a dope poem, that's "If I Must Die," I believe is the title of that poem. Claude McKay, y'all, if y'all haven't checked out Claude McKay, go check out Claude McKay. Has some dope resources and some information for us. And there's so many other, Zornil Hurston, you got Langston Hughes, like all the heavy hitters at that time are vital to the Harlem Renaissance. We have people even like James Weldon Johnson, who wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing." This is out of that movement of folks. You have W.E.B. Du Bois, talented 10th folks who are also involved and engaged. And so you see different aspects of what people were beginning to see what Black identity looked like. You had some who were like, okay, we need to adhere to politics of respectability. We want to make sure that, yes, we are embracing the arts. Yes, we are, engaging in politics, and we are doing collective action. And they did have collective action back then. People don't know that. But they did have collective action where these parades and these, different efforts and movements, that's essentially what this all was. So when people
It's
talk, oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
Yes,
sorry, no, it's interesting, right, that we often don't think about collective action when we do at that same time period in relation to unions and workers' unions. And so it's fascinating that we have these two things happening at the same time, and one is not seen as collective action. So I just want to name that.
that is good. No, that's a good point, because yes, you do have a bunch of labor movements. You got farmers who are also doing, different strikes and different things of that nature as well. You're absolutely on par. Yeah. So it is interesting that, in the 60s, when and I'm going historical. So when scholars were talking specifically about, like, what does it mean to have this civil disobedience and to protest in the streets, and they were thinking of it as like aimless people kind of wandering, right? But that's not actually the case. There's a history that is aligned with what Black people have been doing from the beginning, of parading, of marching, of demonstrating to proclaim what they felt was their right.
Hmm. So one of the things I'm so curious about as you speak, and I think I may have spoken with you about this, and by this point the episode would have aired already, with Elizabeth Hinton, talking about America on Fire: The Untold Histories of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. And one of the things that it brought up for me is the reminder that many of the solutions that we have been looking for, that we're asking for now, were some of the same solutions that were brought up in the Kerner report, and some of the same things that have been known since the 60s. And before that, I had just equated that with information we knew since the 80s and the 90s. And so I'm curious, to learn, because I'm wondering if, as the more we learn about, particularly about Black history, does that then extend the understanding of social movements? So can you tell us a little bit about these? I'm so curious about these protest movements, and the 1910s and 20s that you were referring to.
Yeah, no problem. So the first one, usually folks frame it in a way where it shows that the East St. Louis race riots occurred, and then from there, there was pretty, I wouldn't say an immediate response, but it took a few weeks, and then there was a response where they participated in what was called the Negro Silent Protest Parade of 1917. So it happened towards the end of the month in July. And it's estimated that, and these are rough numbers, that about 10,000 Black men, women, and children protested in the streets of New York down Fifth Avenue. So if you are interested, which this is how I actually got so intrigued by this particular protest parade, and that was through someone who referred me to go search Black women in white,
Hmm.
and I literally searched Black women in white, um, and that picture was one of the first pictures that popped up at that time. So I don't know if it's still the case now, but that was definitely the case back in 2014 when I was initially doing my research paper. So that's essentially what happened. So what I'm beginning to find and craft the narrative around is that Black women were vital to the march. And in some ways, they do not show up in the archive, which is so fascinating to me. So nobody steal this because this is my dissertation. But it's so fascinating to me because these Black women were not showing up in the records, but they were showing up in large numbers, just represented in the film footage. Which it wasn't until I believe it was like, I think it was like the 70s that over in Canada, they dug up a whole bunch of film reels and they only have like a 30-second clip of this silent protest parade. So it's by, by just by grace that we have that image and that
Hmm.
representation of what transpired. But even the photographs, we see all these Black women, we see Black children, and then we also see some Black men, but not nearly the extent to the representation of Black women. So that's my analysis, is focusing on them and doing a deep dive. There were also parades that took place when Black soldiers returned from World War I, so specifically the 369th Infantry. So I'm focusing on the representations of Black masculinity and even around the family and the way that they showed up at that parade and what they
Hmm.
did and participated in. Of course, we have representations of like, derogatory terminology and things like that. And I'm even being mindful of that because a lot of the connections that I'm finding is tied back to the South, which is
Hmm.
very interesting to me. And this is around that Great Migration time period.
Hmm.
And then the last set of
Hmm.
parades is the Garvey parades that took place in the 1920s. And that's around the time when he's really trying to galvanize people. And this is folks who are working class people, not necessarily that talented 10th like W.E.B. Du Bois, but galvanizing people around going back to Africa. And so
Hmm.
I'm looking at specifically how the representations of Blackness shows up there and how they're crafting their narrative as well.
Yeah, so this episode, y'all, this is really a history lesson, right? Because I'm going to ask a lot of questions so we could get you all to know a little bit more history, and I love history. So, can you say a little bit about, when we're talking about the talented 10th and W.B. Du Bois, and I'm not sure if you mentioned double consciousness or any of that stuff. Where would you say, if folks wanted to dig into that information, what would you say a good starting place will be? Because I think it's hard to define without going on a whole nother topic what all of these things are. But where would someone start at?
Dang, Enzi, you are taking it. I hope that people actually stay in tune because they're, because people be like, listen, this is too much history for me. but I'm geeking out right now. So I would say that you would want to start with Du Bois's Talented 10, or excuse me, Talented 10, The Souls of Black Folks. And he talks specifically around the different things that he's experiencing. There'll be some Negro spirituals in there, just a blurb of some, and then he goes on to write. Excellent resource to start. I'm trying to think. So James Weldon Johnson wrote a lot of excellent resources as well. I would definitely check out James Weldon Johnson's stuff.
And
Um,
one of the things we could also do is we could put a resource list if needed in like a
yeah,
on a page somewhere. So I
yeah.
didn't even think about that. So that's a great. I don't want to and keep letting me know who like good suggestions on where to check out as well, because history is so important, especially when we're able to dig back into and and rediscover and unearth some of the histories that have been uh, I don't want to say hidden. I would hidden or buried or taken away from us or changed to change what we understand as the narrative, and in some ways really thinking about a lot about as we're talking about this time period and the Great Migration, and you talked a little bit about soldiers coming home, and I'm thinking a lot about a lot of how reactionary movements happened after, whether it's after Reconstruction, whether it's after however we look at it, that there have been a lot of uh, reactions to progress, as well as I would most of these protests were also reactions to the pushback against progress, right? Like these, we have this narrative, this uh, cycle, I think, in what I will call the history of this. Um, the history of the colonized piece of this nation of uh, progress, and then stopping progress, and then things just not even slowing down, but just going backwards and backwards and backwards. And it's a fascinating piece. And really, where I'm getting at or thinking about is wanting to kind of shift gears a little bit and move into talking a little bit about Juneteenth. One of the things that I am constantly thinking about when I think about Juneteenth, particularly in light of so many different things in relation to laws. And this year we've had an people are on death row still, right? And we've people have been lots of things have been happening. I've been thinking about Juneteenth in the sense that Juneteenth is a reminder that those in power don't actually have to abide by the law. And thinking about, we often talk about in the sense of, oh, these slaves were given this information that they probably already knew that they were free. But the question in my brain is constantly about um, how those in power are able to manipulate the information to not follow through with um, to really not actually follow through with things, and to kind of do lip service, right? Because even though we know that the Emancipation Proclamation, if I was a slave during that time period, living where my family lived in a slave state, my family was not free by the Emancipation Proclamation because they were Union states. And so thinking about, in many ways, that as a sense of lip service in some ways. Um, and that gets me to Juneteenth as a national holiday. Would love to talk about that a little bit, especially as we go from last year, the typical um, person didn't know very much about Juneteenth, to now people who hate Black people. Like, I'm not even joking. People who literally hate Black people uh, gets it off.
Yes, Enzi, you just opened up a whole can of worms here. Ugh. This is hard. It's hard. It's hard because I feel like there is this perception of progress, and that perception of progress is particularly dangerous because what it has the capacity to do is to skew that memory that I was talking to you about.
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm,
has the capacity to skew that, especially when folks look back at the records and see, oh, wow, progress has happened. But we have
mm-hmm,
to think about how quickly, like, it. Did you notice how quickly things were like, okay, it's now law, right? And it's like, whoa, what just happened here? Like, there was no real intentional deliberation. There was none of that, right? And there was none of that for a reason, which is why it's so important for us to have our eyes and our ears attuned to what's not being said,
mm-hmm,
because we can
mm-hmm,
see that they're taking critical race theory out of the schools and like all of this stuff, right? We know that even talking about Texas, right? Some
mm-hmm,
schools even in Texas, they're talking about enslavement as if it was it was something that was like free will servitude. Like it
Hmm.
wasn't as harsh as it really was. Like it wasn't, they're not telling the truth. And I have
Hmm.
a real problem, and this is even at some of the institutions that I've been, affiliated with. I have a real problem with people positioning this false narrative of what it looks like when just to put on optics, but that's not really what's transpiring. You're not
Hmm.
really telling us what's going on here. And so I'm all about telling the truth. And I even had a meeting earlier this week and said, I'm telling the truth. I don't know what you are going to do, but I can only speak for me and myself. And truth telling is where I'm at. So
Hmm.
you putting into law officials, right? Singing this whole, singing the song of like, yes, we've arrived, and positioning this as if we really have, when in actuality, we have not. I
Hmm.
think Derek Chauvin at that point, I don't even know if he had been actually convicted at that point. What do you
Yeah,
remember?
Derek Chauvin was convicted on April 20th, and he was given his sentence on Friday, I believe. We will, folks who are listening, especially that in Minneapolis, they would know the answers. But
Yeah.
I believe it's April 20th was the conviction, um, if I'm remembering correctly.
But the
Um,
sentencing wasn't it after?
the sentencing was just now, just
Yeah.
last week.
Yes. So, so it's things like that, right? So that's essentially what I'm saying. Like the fact that we have all of these things you were even mentioning, there's folks on death row, we got people in the prison systems over some trumped up drug charges, or just drug charges that now we making it legal, right? So
Hmm.
it's all
Well,
of
yeah. So basically, what you're saying is, because it's not about not. What I'm hearing you saying is, it's not about celebrating Juneteenth, and it's not even about it being a national holiday. That actually isn't a bad thing in and of itself. It is, what do we do with it, and so it is, how do we celebrate a holiday, right? We're Texas, that we're celebrating this holiday that is about Texas, honoring and letting the lives, quote unquote, slaves know that they're free, when folks aren't even really teaching about slavery.
right,
And it's this, we talk about this perception of progress. What I really think a lot about is, people have this perception, for example, that anti-Semitism is not really that bad anymore because of perceived progress or because of stereotypes or whatever. And I could tell you that anti-Semitism is on the rise, just like many other forms of oppression and bigotry. And uh, it's important to be able to know, because as we whitewash or as we change and erase history, it shifts so much of our understanding. But for me, the scariest piece of it is what happens when we don't know that we are actually repeating history over and over and over again, and how do we navigate through that? So, you know, I, one of the so this is a podcast on intersectionality, and I wanted to make sure to be able to ask you, and I don't, we're touching on a lot of topics here, but what I'm really curious about is, what is it like for you as a black woman in the professional world, I guess, is for lack of better words. What has that experience been like for you? Especially, I don't know if you can speak of it, before COVID, if that was an experience, but what is it? That's very. I know it's a very big question. So.
yeah, no, but that's still a good question. So it's been challenging. Um, it's been isolating. It's been trying. Um, it's sometimes hostile.
Mm.
Um, and it has not been very affirming in my Black identity. I've had to traverse a lot of territory that is usually white spaces, so it's
Mhm.
very challenging. So, and in the past, and to be honest, I've been in private schools all my life, which have been predominantly white. I've gone to several schools now, so on and so forth. And so having my black identity, being a woman, it's been one, is just to
Mhm.
To keep it real, it's been one. It's been very difficult. And then also having the knowledge that I have and the wherewithal and the research background,
Mhm,
people underestimate, like you're saying, Enzi, the fact that with history, we have a tendency to repeat things and that
mhm,
there's a denial. No, we are in the 21st century. None of that is happening. And it's
mhm,
a real wake up call to some people when I say, okay, well let's do a deep dive real quick. Let's just do a
mhm,
quick tutorial on what has happened.
mhm.
So, yeah.
Do you find that people oftentimes, one of the questions I my brain is like, so what can people do when they're in the workplace to make it
Mm,
easier, right? And then my brain says, nah, Enzi, don't ask that question because is it on you to teach and educate folks? How do we navigate through that? But really, what I'm thinking about is mm, what does it take? What would it look like for you to be able to thrive in the workplace? And really thinking about, can you remember, at least in your experience, particularly, you said you're Kenosha,
yeah.
Wisconsin, a smaller a town, like thinking about how those how things operate, right? Thinking about really thinking about how many times can you pinpoint when people was able to allow you to be in your black joy,
Mhm.
right? And thinking about, uh, I've really thinking about experiences of, as I hear you speaking, I'm sure you tell lots of experiences of where your joy was just squashed in the workplace. And so maybe I'm gonna flip the question around and ask you, what would it feel like to actually be able to experience your blackness in all its fullness in the workplace? And then after you talk about that, we'll go back and talk about. I'll ask you another question about anti-blackness because in my experience, people often aren't aware that they're engaging in it because it's such seems to be a part of everything of our society.
Enzi, whew, you coming hard today. I wasn't prepared. I was not prepared for
I'm
this.
so sorry.
No, this is so good. It's allowing me to reflect too. So, what it would look like is complete transparency. What it would look like is honoring the histories of blackness that in some cases is not always, is not it is what it is, right? So it's acknowledging that it is what it is, but in light of that there's still progress, joy, there's peace, there's community. And I think that that's essentially, and there's beautiful families that are established, there's beautiful businesses that are established, like there's beauty in it. And I think that an environment that allows you to be free to think, to process, to be able to just be and not want to filter, to stifle, to prohibit you from growing. That is a toxic environment, and I would love it if there could be a lot more of openness and willingness for folks to just simply say, I got that wrong. I really did do.
Mhm,
I got that way wrong, and I'm so sorry. How do we move forward? Owning it. When white folks, a lot of times they do not want to own it that they made a mistake, and that's okay. You made a mistake, but let's make that better. That's what
mhm,
I'm here
mhm,
for. But a lot of times there's none of that. There's this hostility against, like, oh, well, just because you're black and this is your experience, that's your problem. That's your fault.
mhm,
When it's no, 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 this is not my fault. This is a
mhm,
community, a national reckoning's fault, right?
mhm. Yeah, it's as you say that it's more than a national reckoning, right? Because it's a Northern America reckoning
It is.
of major concerns and major problems. And what I hear you saying is it's really a lot about repairing harm and teshuva and being able to recognize when harm is done. How do we move beyond that? And for some reason in this nation, Jay Smooth is a DJ who is incredible. And I remember watching a video from him a few years ago where he talked about the way in which race is looked at in the United States so differently, and talked about, if you said to someone, you have something in your teeth, no one would say, I have good dental hygiene. There is no way that I have something stuck in my teeth. But when you say, yo, that thing you just did was racist, oh, no, 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 I'm not a bad person. And so part of it is this. I'm bringing this up to say part of it is we have to recognize that we are going to make mistakes. And in fact, one of the number one rules for me with anti-racism work and any type of oppression work is I'm going to make mistakes. I engage in anti-blackness, right? Like those are just the natural aspects of a society that thrives, that actually is only able to thrive and succeed off of anti-blackness. And so, really get into a place where we could acknowledge it, because it seems like the harm comes in when it's denied, as if it's not actually happening, and really thinking a lot about and for me, I think the reason I asked about that black joy, right, and what the black thriving looks like, is thinking about connection that with the black uh, protest, but also just thinking about connecting that with the Harlem Renaissance at that time period. And so when I think about, we started talking about protests, but I really think about the Harlem Renaissance and just so much of the birth of all of what I understand to be my full blackness, right? Like it is so much embedded in that and understanding that, and so just so curious on how do we even shift, right, the narrative of, as we talk about these movements and as we talk about even the black rebellions of the 60s. Most of those, folks were dancing and partying and having a good time, even here at George Floyd Square at times, right? And so just really thinking about um, that fullness of black joy, and wondering, do you ever get the chance to explore and talk about that with your work that you do?
Yeah, so I do hold space, and I've been holding space in my business as well as my day to day what I do professionally in my job as well for Black students to just to celebrate, to talk about Black joy, to talk about the experiences that they have, and what new music is out that they like to bop to or whatever, that's ultimately where it is, and I think that there's missed opportunities when we're not allowed to express that Black joy and to be free in it.
Hmm. And it's a huge missed opportunity, and it's an unfortunate missed opportunity, because not only do we seldom get to experience black joy, when we are experiencing black joy, it's that fear of, do we get to actually be joyful, or is this going to cause the death of somebody? And it's that harsh reality as we're thinking about what does that black joy look like, and how do you hold on to that without losing hope? And I want to name that. I love that as there's these movements, especially around equity and inclusion work, there's also now this larger movement of collective healers at the same time to go hand in hand with that work, because as we're thinking about healing the past, even in some ways, and I've never spoken with you about this, so I'm not sure uh,
Mhm.
if you, I don't want to go too long about this, but if you have any thoughts about, how do you think that we can actually think about healing our past via understanding historical, we talk a lot about historical trauma, and so I'm thinking, even if there's historical trauma, then is there historical healing?
Mm. And my mind goes back to South Africa, what they did in South Africa. Yeah, and I I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm empowered because I know the history, and I don't know everything. Let me be clear. There's some things that I know that I still need to brush up on, and I'm ever evolving, and I'm always learning, and I'm always engaging. That's the point of being a lifelong learner. Um, but with that, that's a good question. Yeah, there's something to that, and I also love to provide healing spaces. So what I've been doing, and this isn't something I've been able to do yet as a workshop, but I'm looking forward to doing it, and that's having like a writing workshop, an
Mhm.
expressive space workshop of just Black people being in space and celebrating and joining together, and even talking about, hey, this is a touching point that I know I need to heal from. This is something that my family has dealt with, and I'm ready to release it, right? And that's
Mhm.
empowering. That's
Mhm.
empowering. So I want us to get to a place where we can do that. And I've done a little bit of that with a group that I've held. It's called Sister to Sister. I've done a little bit of healing space with that group in particular. It's for women of color, not just Black women, but there's
Mhm.
quite a few Black women in that session, and we do a deep dive, and it's good. There's been some tears, I know, even on my end. I had some like reflective moments with the young people. Like that was a really good and dope conversation.
Mm. Mm. That sounds very powerful and very exciting. If someone wanted to reach out to you, what is the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yes, so feel free to check out my website. It's cicelyhunter.com. My name is spelled Cicely. Hunter is Hunter.com. Or you can feel free to email me. And I'm on all the social platforms. So LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. I do have a TikTok. um, and my name on most of those is Cecily with a B as in boy, and then Hunter, my middle initial, .com or what have you. So if you wanted to send me a direct email, you can reach me there. And Facebook is pretty much, I believe, the same. So feel free to look me up, and I'd love to have conversations or even support your organization, your entity on how to better understand practices, whether it be a training, whether it be a workshop, whether it be just holding space so that folks can express and be at liberty to express rather than feeling like they have to hold back. I'm
Mhm.
all about it. So
Awesome. Yeah, that's exciting because I think so oftentimes we very seldom have space to feel like we can make the mistakes as well as understand, and it is becoming really clear to me in the work that I do that oftentimes there's just a lack of understanding of anti-blackness, just like there's a lack of understanding of anti-Semitism, and so people say things that are dog whistles. That as a Black Jew, I'm like, wow, there's so many things here that's happening, and so Cicely Hunter, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this is Enzi, your host of Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just skin deep. Until next time. Kumba Hineni, a podcast on intersectionality, more than just getting deep, is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast.